Hello again to all my friends in Zambia. This is Steve Walkup and Patterson bringing you the Gospel of Mark and Bemba.
Abana bose mu Zambia ninevo Steve Walkup nomunandi Patterson twakonkanya apo mu Bemba mwibuku lya kwa Marko.
Now, as you remember from our last session, we have closed out the first half of the book and we are moving into the second half.
Nga mwayabukisha bwino okukunuma twalitampa okubelenga n'okupika pakati ka kitabo.
That is, Jesus is going to show his resurrection glory clearly by triumphing over death.
Apa twalasa mwana chikulu alina okwisa chimfya kwisa pita n'okuchimfya enfwa.
Now, I put this picture on the screen, and you can see that depending on how you look at it, it can be a pretty young woman or a very ugly old woman.
Atapa chinefu mungalolesha mwewe ne pachikokechi ngamawolesha sana.
So if you know,
mwana kashi mwaiche nangula kalamu.
so if you notice that for the older woman, you see a big nose right here and a chin right down here with a shawl around her head.
Bana kashi abakote bera kwetu muno kalamba n'abafwala era ya fita era okumushabikireko echabuta.
But to see the pretty young woman, you have the black up here as her hair, and then her chin here, and a really slight neck with a shawl on.
Mwasa ulekesha unapamukashana ule munono nakwate mshishi isha black ero na pale moneka pampamenso yakwe kamukashana kaiche.
So you can ask people, which one do they see, and half see an ugly old woman, half see a beautiful young woman.
Atapanga mulefu akuti mwalandati mule mona mukashana nangula abakalamba abana kashi.
So the question becomes, what do the disciples see? Do they see Jesus as the ruling Messiah who has come to inaugurate the kingdom, or as the suffering servant who's going to die on the cross?
Atapa nombo bishop pakulandati abayuda bale munashani Yesu ngulio wishire mukuchula nokwisa kwa pacha pindama nangula ulio nokwisa tungulula.
Remember, in the first half of the book, we saw that the disciples saw Jesus as the Messiah. The question is, do they see him as what his role will be? They think he's going to rule in the kingdom right away, but instead he's going to go to the cross.
Atapa nomba bena twaisa mwana tabasambi bale munashani Yesu bale mwana kwati ni ulokesa tungulula nanga bale mwanati
So in booklet 1, that is the first half of the book, most disciples are clear as to see the messianic identity, but unclear as to see the messianic mission.
Atapa abasambi tebamonekesha bwino kwisa mwanati uyu eukesaba wakubalula angomulubushi.
7 times in the first half of the book, Jesus questioned his disciples' recognition of his messianic identity and mission.
Atapa nikwingi Yesu wakwe nokubepusha umonati ni feshile mukuchita.
In 638, he asked how many loaves that they have. Go and see, and when they found out, they had 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Atapa nakatwafika mu chapter 6 na 38 pada 35 aliza bepusha ati mukate nesa pendwa nshimkwete balande fato kwete fe utunono.
In 8:5, he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7.
mu 8 na 5 alanda tukwete fe mikate shiri fe 7 notumasa bitu nono.
In 8:17, they asked, "Why do you reason because you have no bread?"
Ati mu 8 na verse ya 17 alebe pushati nishimulela ndilapo wale tukwete mukate.
Again in 8:17, he asked, "Do you not yet perceive or understand? Is your heart still hardened?"
Ati apo kwisa fika mu chapter 8 na 17 alebe pushati imwe nanomba imitima shenu shirisha kosa.
In 8:18, he said, "You have eyes, but you do not see. You have ears, but you do not hear."
Mu chapter 18 pa 8 na pa 18 alelanda ati imwe tamumona nangu mwaekwata amenso.
Then in 18, he said, "Do you not remember what happened earlier?"
Ati aisabe pusha mu 18 ati pusha imwe tamulebukisha fintu fyachitikire kunuma.
In 8:29, he said, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ."
Ati mu 8 na 29 alisabe pusha ati mutirati ni ani? Ati Petro walandira ati ni mwebo oshikulu.
Now, 3 times Jesus will remind his disciples of his messianic mission. That is, that he is going to suffer, die, and resurrect.
Ati apa Yesu alina okwisavukisha basambi bakwe ati alina okwisa ikatwa bakamwipaya nokwisafwa kaila kesa tutubuka.
These will all come in booklet number 2.
Ati ifeefo tungabona mu kipungo kyalenga bubiri.
Let's read 8:31. Mark chapter 8, verse 31, please.
Atubereke chapter 8 na verse ya
Verse
31.
31.
Chapter 8 na verse ya 31 iretira ati kabiri atendeka ukuba sambilisha okuti umwana wa muntu ali n'okuchula ifinge n'okusulwa kubakalamba na bashimapepo bakalamba na bakalemba n'okwipaiwa n'okubuka kabiri abo pene pakapita inshuku shitatu.
Okay, so we see here that Jesus, for the first time in booklet 2, is going to tell them that the Son of Man is going to suffer many things before he rules in the kingdom.
Ati apa ena tampokula walondera bwino atumwa kuteka takula Afrika.
That suffering will include being persecuted, killed, and then raising from the dead 3 days later.
Ati apa kulemfuka tukaba kuchutika kabikesa ipaiwa lenga papita fresh kushitatu alina okwisavuka.
Now let's read Mark chapter 9, verses 31 and 32. He's going to repeat this.
Mark chapter 9, verse 31 na 32. Muntu aishiwa pantu ala asambilishiwa abasambi bakwe nokutira kulibena umwana wa muntu akapewa umwine y'abantu ilyo bakamwipaya na pa kumwipaya akema kabiri nga papita inshuku shitatu. Lelo abene tabaishiwe ichebo kaili bali tinene kumwipusha.
Notice the 3 important components here. He will be betrayed, he will be killed, and he will raise.
Ati apa balina okwisa mwikata kabiri alina okwisa afwa lelo akesavuka.
Now let's turn to 10:32. He's going to repeat this a 3rd time.
Atumone nomba mu 10 chapter 32 ya mako wine. Apa nomba yaba ya butatu. Awe babiri munshila balemene pokuya ku Yerusalema. Na Yesu ali batangirire. abasambi bali pele balemoneka batira iyo uli 12 atendekele kubeba ifya lwishe vyaponenemo.
Notice he says the same thing. Again, he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be killed, and on the third day, he's going to rise again.
ati hapana nga twamona palife bintu mufina filelanda ati aina okwisa ikatwa kabiri imushuku shibiri aina okwisa abuka kapapita feshuku shitatu.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the blind man's need for a two-stage healing and the disciples' need for a two-stage teaching.
Ati apa twailandepo bwino sana pali ile mpofu yashile mona nokuposhua pakubalirapo ero nechalengekeshepo yaisa monesha.
So I've put this chart up here to show you that the blind man is a representation of the disciples.
Ati apa nabika chichikope chakulanda ati bwaba ule muntu ushakweta menso ale mininako abasambi bakwe.
Now, in chapter 8, verse 22, we see that the blind man needed healing. He couldn't see at all, he was completely blind.
Ati mu chapter 8 na verse ya 22 twalelanga ati talolekeshe pantu ali wapofula.
In 1:16 through 20, the disciples needed to know that Jesus is God's Messiah. They couldn't see it all.
Ati apa ekirefu okubalangisha bwino ati Yesu ekalubushi waisa mkuba pususha.
Now, in Mark 8:23, Jesus does the first stage of the healing where he uses his hands and mouth to help them see.
Ati apa kaina kanwa kwakwe pokulanda ati apole bwino.
Notice then Jesus' first teaching, 121 through 8:16, he used
Ati
miracles,
apa
that is his
chitanga bwino
hands,
ati
and
Yesu
he used his mouth to help the disciples see.
ati abo mfeshe ama kanwa kakwe n'amaboko pokulanda ati omonekeshe bwino.
Now, in 8:23, Jesus is going to question after the man has been healed in the first stage, what do you see?
Ati pa 8:23 shukuru mwinale balanga pufubenga mona. No problem, easy.
Notice in 8:17 and 18 and 27, Jesus is going to question his disciples after he taught them, why don't you understand? Why is your heart still hardened?
Ati apa chile turanga bwino no kukonko kumo for next week.
Okay. Now we see that the assessment is the man could not see clearly, so there was additional healing that was needed.
Ati apa muntu amwene bwino sechalengera ati apokelele kuposhwa kwa bubiri.
That is, the man saw men as trees. Not he couldn't clearly see their facial features, but he knew that they were men.
Ati apa eno lyo muntu atampire kumona abantu kwati fimuti lelo afuele okuposhwa n'okupwirapo.
Likewise, Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? They said, you are the Christ. But Peter was rebuked for saying that he would suffer, die, that Jesus would suffer, die, and rise.
ati apo ekyalengera okubepusha ati beena basosa ati niyani ati alandi ati mulikikulu lero wapala Peter enalikena sana ati nangu mukafwa butamu bwafya naye nenkaba naimwe.
So just as Jesus saw the blind man needed an additional step to see clearly, so after assessing his disciples, he saw they could see his messianic identity, but not his messianic mission, so they needed extra teaching.
ati apo ekyalengera ati ofusambirishwe kwa bubiri bantabale mona ati unishukulu waisa mukubalubula na vintu efyo akesa apitamu efyo akuchula nokwisa tutubuka kabino okwisaya.
So in 8:25, Jesus puts his hands on the man's eyes a second time, told him to look up to heaven, and the blind man saw everything clearly.
ati apo ekyalengera yesu kwebawulira owali mpofu ati mukuwa bubiri ati nomba kuti alwesa alolekesha pakwisa mwikata ati alisamona bwino bwino nokumona abantu talemona efyumu talemona fyo ati nomba bantu balisaposhiwa mpwirapo.
In Jesus' second teaching, that is the second half of the book, Jesus needed to clarify his suffering and messianic mission, and the disciples needed to pray.
ati apo ekyalengera ati aba basambi bakolekeshe bwino pantu balingera nokupepa okwisa munefino okwisa kitika kuntanshi.
After looking up, the blind man saw everything clearly, and after disciples preached his death and Jesus preached his death and resurrection, and the disciples saw him, they preached the message clearly.
Na yesu asambisha basambi bakwe chebo na balisa mfikisha bwino bwino pokuyasambirisha pa mkuu wa bubiri.
Let's go to Mark chapter 16 and read verses 19 to 20.
Atwala kuli Marko chapter 16. Marko chapter 16. Verse ya 19 fika na 20. Marko chapter 16. Na verse ya 19.
16 verses 19 and 20.
Verse 19 na 20, 16 na verse ya 19 na 20. Ilyo shukuru Yesu pokupokulanda kuli vena alisendewe ali mulu nokwikala lubali kukulyo kwa lesa lero balya bafumineko bayile konse na shukuru alebombera pamo nabo kusosela ichebo cha fishuro ifya ku konkapo.
Notice here that when they looked up, they saw Jesus' ascension, just as when the blind man looked up, he could see clearly.
Ajapa yabaisire muna batolodeshe balisa muna Yesu aleima nokuya mumulo.
So we can see that this is a metaphor, this blind man is a metaphor for what the disciples need to learn.
Ajapa ichire turangirira fe ajabasambi fintu bali nokusambirira.
Now, Jesus's first passion prophecy, so when I say passion prophecy, it is Jesus prophesying the 3 times where he said he's got to go to Jerusalem, suffer, be killed, and resurrect.
Ajapa ngayanda ti akwetenomba icho chilepiliwula okulanda ati alina okuya ku yerusalema akekatwa n'okwipayiwa lero akesabuka pantanshi.
So his first passion prophecy led to resistance. That is, Peter said, never am I going to let you do that. They had an errant view of suffering.
Tenga makonka bwino abasambi bakwe Peter fili alandire ati tetimileke imokuya pamulandu wa kuchutika.
The second passion prophecy led to confusion. That is, they were not resisting, they were confused.
Ati ape akonkerepo tabaleka nayo lero tabayishibire ife akuchita pantomano yawe yadi ayasa.
The third passion prophecy will reveal what their role was to witness the passion.
Ati ape akulekereshako yayinomba nokwisa balanga ife kesa chitabena efiri kesa moneka pantanshi.
So notice they go from resistance to confusion to having a revelation.
Achanga mati mumone vaisa fuma kuchimfulu ero nomba vaisa la pantanshi kwisa mona ero vailuka.
Now, in the next part, 11:1 through 13:37, Jesus is going to have varied reception in Jerusalem, anticipating his coming passion.
Ati apa pakutampa mu chapter 11 kufika pa na pa 11 achire muna Yesu ro aingire mu Yerusalema nokwisa mono mulimo owali nokwisa bomba.
First of all, Jesus received praise when he entered Jerusalem.
Ati apa chakwalira poshukuru aingira no mu Yerusalema kabiri abomba nokwamya mu tempele ya kwa.
Then Jesus will cleanse the temple and teach his disciples about faith and forgiveness. Then Jesus will cleanse the temple and teach his disciples about faith and forgiveness.
Pamulandu wa kwamya itempele ya kwaresa elio nefu bafula okusambira pamulandu wa kwererako abantu.
Jesus will then have confrontation with the leadership.
Ati apa nomba Yesu alina kwisa kangana n'abakalamba balipo.
Then Jesus prophesied about God's upcoming wrath on Israel.
Ati apa Yesu aisaliwa nomba na papukaliwo buleisa pa isaka cha Israel kuma kuli lesa tata.
In the third section, Jesus' passion and his resurrected glory will be revealed, that it will be fulfilled.
Ati apa nomba shukuru alina okwisalanga olubuto lwakwe eno okwisa moneka ifyo lesa chitika kuntanshi.
First of all, Jesus predicted his betrayal.
Ati apa shukuru alanda pamulandu wafu bakesa mushitisha.
Then his betrayal will be occurring just as he had predicted.
Ati apa nomba bakesa mushitisha bakesa alanga pamulandu wa ifintu fino kusachitika kuntanshi.
Jesus' prophecy will be fulfilled as he was tried, crucified, buried, and arose.
Ati apa shukuru nomba fikesa filikishwa fyefya kwanda ati alina okwisafwa kabiri alina okwisabuka.
Okay, so let's look at these three teachings, and each one of these, they begin with Jesus' prophecies and then have a reaction from the disciples to the prophecies.
Ati apa natumwe nomba okufunda kwa shukuru valasasanga fimo ife nokwisava.
So, when we look at these sections, we see at the beginning, Jesus prophesies what's going to happen. And we saw that he's going to say the same thing 3 times.
Ati apa twalaisa mona ati nga xikulu alande fintu nga fikesa moneka omuku wa chitatu.
And we talked about how the reactions would be from rejection to confusion to compliance.
Ati apa twalaisa mona nombovu afe kubukesa ya nopusa pita kuisafika na kumpelo.
Then, through the rest of the book, those booklets, we're going to see that there is a lesson on discipleship. How are they supposed to act when these things happen?
Ati apa tinokuisa mona nomba pa cha butatu finshifo abasamba kesa chita ifintwanga fachitika.
Okay, so first of all, Jesus' first passion prophecy led to rebuke of Peter's resistance.
Ichakubyalirapo Yesu lyafika nokuleta efalefwaya tabamupokerere bwino oyo kwabo kukana.
Jesus tells Peter, you need to understand something. You're not calling the shots. You're not saying what the plan is. God the Father has a plan and you need to follow it.
Ati apa Yesu ayeba Peter atiwe teokwete nokwisha efya kuchita lesa tato mwine ewa kwata mapange kaine fondi okwisa chita.
The idea would be there would be future reward in the coming kingdom if these disciples would follow through on the commitment to follow God's plan.
Ati apa ekikanga tulesambirapo kyakwanda ati kukesaba ilambo ila kubakapokerera abantu nga bakonka bwino mukuteeka obwo buli n'okwisaayisa.
Then the Father is going to clarify the confusion about Jesus' kingdom of God authority.
Ati apa nabalesa tata alina okwisa balanga bwino n'obwafeefu bulina okwisa pita n'okwisa kwa.
After Jesus rebuked the deaf and dumb spirit, his disciples for failing to rely on the Father because they lacked prayer and faith.
Ati apa kusafika fene nchitabafirwa abasambi bakwe lero lesa omweno Yesu mweno mbo kusiteka fe pali lesa tata.
So what I want you to understand here is now the deaf and dumb spirit are the disciples, because he's going to rebuke his disciples just like he rebuked the deaf and dumb spirit.
Tusharelanda nokumfwa chimpashida ati chalengenya fe pamonga basambi bakwe abashale umfwa ichebo.
Then we see in Jesus' second prophecy of the 3, it led to confusion because the disciples had hardened hearts.
Ati apa nombecha kulekesha ko twaisa mona ati basambi mitima shabo shali shakosa tabale umfwa.
Here, Jesus is going to again foretell that the disciples' current Christ-like service is going to give them future recompense or rewards if they are willing to follow.
Ati apa shikwale balanga nokubeba ati kuntanshi kulino kwisapukalele fintu kana baipera nokukonka ifo balefunda.
Then in 10:1 through 31, Jesus is going to clarify their misunderstandings about one's current life and its effect on the future life.
ati mu chapter 10 kutamba pa 32 kufika na pa 34 achikesalanga ife ubwikashi bwino kwisawa kuntanshi mu bwikashi mu buteko buleisa.
And that is their role in the future kingdom.
Ati chisebalanga bifaye nokwisa chita mu bwikashi buli nokwisa isa kuntanshi.
Then Jesus is going to foretell that the disciples' current suffering determines his kingdom status and greatness.
Ati mukwisa pita mu bwafya nokuchura fulelanga fye ife ubwikashi buli nokwisa wa kuntanshi.
And then finally, we have blind Bartimaeus, who will become Jesus' disciple after receiving his eyesight.
Ati apa twaisa manomba ile mpofu isa ukamenzo yaisa banomba umusambishi wa kwa Yesu.
Okay, so that takes that section. Now we're going to look at the threefold ministry prophecy that fell on dull ears.
Ati apa chiranga busomo bwa chitike ubo kwadefikira fye pamatwi ayo kwatina yakoma.
This episode from 827 to 1052 begins at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus says he's going to the cross, and it ends near Jerusalem where he would have his triumphal entry.
Ati apa ifiranga umo Yesu aino kwisa pita no kwisa fika pacha pindama leo na idenshita ailengira mu Yerusalemu na bantu bonse bamumona.
So each passion prophecy follows a teaching so that they would better understand God's plan and their role in the plan.
Ati apa mukusambirisha konse kulelanga fe shukuru aino kwisalanga kubalanga.
Now, the key thing for you and I to understand is that we cannot be rewardable and rule with Jesus in the coming kingdom if we don't understand what the plan is and what our role is in that plan.
Fwe kana twaba kusambirisha ero tungeshwa amapanga ya kwa shukuru eyo alina ifwe kuntanshi.
Now, we don't have Jesus sitting right next to us telling that, but in fact, we do because we have everything that Jesus told the disciples, and we can learn that if we're willing to follow Jesus' commands as the disciples did, we can be rewardable in the coming kingdom.
Ati apa ifwe teti tatwina shukuru mpepi lelo natukwata fyonse faranje nefe achitike. Enjita mupembera kwesu tino kwisa sambire ifo tungesa ingira mufumu budya no kwisa pokerela ifilambo.
So as we're going through this, I want you to really understand the passion prophecy is told. That is, he would suffer, be killed, and resurrect 3 times.
Ati apa ndefu amakonka bwino bwino obusese mu bwala ndiro mwine ati aino kwisa ikatwa bakamwika takaiwa kesa muipaya lelo akesa tutuka.
The disciples would react to and then hear how they would partake in this plan.
Tubachingirire pomapanga ya ino kwisa pita.
Now, Jesus then would give his disciples lessons, and like Peter, many insiders took offense to the notion of suffering on the cross. They only saw Jesus being the ruler over all the world.
Ati apa na tawale muna kuchula kwa Yesu yo. Tawale muna fe mukuchimfya kwa chalo chonse nokuteka. Tawa mwene mwatu pita mu bwafya.
So our takeaway here is that Herod, the Judean leadership, the crowds, and his disciples all lacked, to varying degrees, an understanding of having faith in God's plan.
ati apa ife tungasenda pono kumva chakwisa mwana pwati awonsaba ofiro okulolekesha nokumona ifyolesa tato mwene apeke.
Herod and the Judean leadership were deaf and blind and therefore rejected Jesus' messianic identity completely.
Ati apa utungulushi wakwa Heroda na banankwe balikana fye kukanina utungulushi wakwa Yesu wine.
But many in the crowds, including his disciples, sought to understand his messianic identity and then better understand his messianic mission.
Ati apa chabulanga chakwanda na basambi bakwe nabo tebawumfikishe bwino ukwenda kwakwe eno mulimo okalamba wakwisadula.
So, hearing the blind man's saw men as trees, Jesus recognized that more healing was needed for them to see clearly.
Ati apa ife Yesu amwene ati impofuta mwene keshere muna bantu kwati fimuti alisa iswisha bwino ati naba bantu aba bafire okusambirisha kwanda ati benga mwana bwino.
So here is Bethsaida, and if we see in 8:22, Jesus, the man came to Bethsaida, and Jesus heals the two-stage healing right here in Bethsaida.
Ati apa ife fyune pala baposheshe ulia ushale mona twashitike mpeseda enchende yashitikemo nokuposhukwa kwa ulia muntu.
Now, Peter's answer, Jesus recognized that the disciples needed more lessons to know how to do the mission.
Ati apa Pepita alelekeshe bwino nokwishwa ife benga bomba umulimo.
Finally, hearing Peter's inability to clearly see Jesus' messianic mission brought additional need for more teaching so that they would understand the mission.
Ati apa kwisa mwana Petro nao mfuikisha nokumonekesha bwino masambirisho ayakubasambisha kukwanda ati bomona ifino kwisa chitika.
And so Jesus is going to spend additional time, just like the two-stage healing, making sure his disciples understand.
Ati apa ati Yesu aino kwisa posa ponshita ikulu chimofe na basambi bakwe kukwanda ati benga poshiwa bwino.
Okay, so the events that took place after Jesus and his disciples retired from their public ministry, somewhere around the Passover of AD 32 to the Festival of Tabernacles in September of AD 32.
Ati apa twalaisa mono mume wakwa Yesu pa yapene mkafe mkurekeresha ako pokuli omulalilo ule wali mu AD 32 nukwisa enda kofe ya kulekesha yashe chitika mu AD 33.
After feeding the 5,000, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to Phoenicia and returned through Decapolis.
Ati apa Yesu pokwisha fukulisha bayamakana ya bantu mumpanga ati aino kwisa werelamo nokuya kwine okuteka polisi.
He then fed the 4,000, and then we had Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi.
Ati palya balayishirelisha abantu akonkerepo eyo na Peteo nao kwisa sasa ati kwisa fumapono kwisa ya kulya kuse Syria kuntanshi kulya.
So in 8:27 through 30, Jesus asked the disciples two questions. Who do you say that I am? They answered the first one, that
ata
is, Jesus is the Christ, clearly.
ata pali bepwisha abantu bandi ati nine bwani atira baishire muna kwisa ati nimwe wo shukuru bena balisa sukafyo bwino pa wipusho wakubalira po wabepwisha.
So let's read Mark 8:27 through 33, please. Let's read Mark 8:27 through 33, please.
Ati eryo Petro amubulire atendeka kumubula awe pokupilibuka n'okumona abasambi bakwe ababiye kunuma yandi ifya kwalesa kanofye abantu ilio pokwita ibumba na basambi bakwe baisa kuli wena atile kuli wena ng'omuntu afwaya kwisa nkonka aikanya umwine asende n'ekipanda chakwe ifyo ankonke.
Okay, so we see here that they pass the messianic identity test that Jesus is the Christ.
Ati apa nomba tulembona Yesu nomba alanga ubukata bwakwe ati amoneka ati mulubushi.
But the disciples fail on the messianic mission test because Jesus says he must suffer, die, and resurrect. And Peter says, never will I let this happen. That is, Peter doesn't want to follow God's plan because he doesn't understand it.